Abbas Boutrab had a plan to blow up an airliner. But this Al-Qaeda suspect wasn't operating in Iraq or Afghanistan. He was downloading instructions and building a bomb in Belfast. But was he a wannabe terrorist or a real threat?
I am totally convinced that this man is a terrorist.
There are people in this country who are clearly determined to launch attacks against the British people.
Sent to prison for 6 years, Boutrab was portrayed as a dangerous terrorist. But was he part of an international network?
They never operate alone. They always work in groups, and there's always a fall guy.
Now the Boutrab case is raising fears that the rise of Islamic fundamentalism abroad is beginning to radicalize some young Muslims in Ireland.
You have to die. You have to kill. There's nothing else in this world.
None of us are safe from this type of attack. Everyone in the free world should feel threatened about this case.
In the last few years, hundreds of people have arrived in Belfast hoping to become part of Northern Ireland's new economic promise. In the summer of 2002, a young man calling himself Abbas Boutrab made his home here.
He was very friendly and pleasant, and he used to make cups of tea for everybody, and everybody was quite fond of him.
Certainly, if you had met Mr. Boutrab, you would have found him a very soft-spoken individual who you would think wouldn't cause anybody any grief.
He was simply a drifter, an illegal immigrant who had gone for 16 years throughout Europe as a marginal, looking for a way to become legal. So he didn't seem like a man who had a purpose, particularly other than surviving in the world it was in.
Abbas Boutrab worked as a housekeeper at the Holiday Inn in central Belfast, where he told staff he was an Italian citizen. But the North African was hiding his true identity and background. It was all part of his clandestine world of false names and bogus passports, a life of secrets and lies.
There are some people who have so cleverly and skillfully disguised their true identity over many years that sometimes it really is virtually impossible to find out exactly who they started out life as.
Although he told different versions of events, the one thing that he constantly said was he was an Algerian Berber.
Months after his conviction for terrorism offences, the life of Abbas Boutrab remains shrouded in mystery. The police still don't know his real name, but what they do know is that his early life began here in Algeria.
I went to visit Abbas Boutrab in jail. He said he came from Algiers itself, the capital, and that he was trained as a mechanic, and he had grown up in a modest background.
By the early 1990s, tensions in Algeria were running high as the newly formed Islamic Salvation Front challenged for power. The country's drift towards civil war may give some insight into Abbas Boutrab's later actions.
If you read the history of Algeria over the last 20 to 25 years, it has been incredibly violent. The number of deaths there due to both terrorist and government activities has gone into several hundreds of thousands. It is highly likely that he had seen some particularly nasty and vicious scenes.
There's no doubt that he grew up in an Algeria which was war-torn. The future of the country and Islamic armed groups played a very important role in threatening and terrorizing the community. So there's absolutely no doubt that he would have known the background to it. He said to me that he had very little interest in international politics or anything to do with politics. If he didn't want to talk about it, maybe it's because he felt that he didn't want to incriminate himself.
Abbas Boutrab, like many of his compatriots, fled Algeria for France. In Paris, he assumed the first of his many identities.
This man had a number of false documents and false identities, and indeed it transpired that he was an expert in the procurement of false documentation and the making of false documentation. We know that he also used the name of Brahim, Ibrahim, Adam Seagrass, Abbas Fawaz and David Guillaume Pellegrini. He was arrested for a handbag snatch in Paris under the name of Murad Ben Ali.
With so many changes of identity, Abbas Boutrab disappeared off the authorities' radar for 3 years, until 1995 when he turned up in Holland. He applied twice for asylum using 2 bogus names. When his claim was refused, Boutrab decided it was time to move on.
Dublin is peripheral. It's not one of the major European capitals. It is a pretty sleepy town in terms of the whole Islamic network. And therefore, the government's eye, the authorities' eye, and the general public's eye have been diverted away from the mosques. So it's entirely plausible that someone like Boutrab could have used this country for 2 or 3 years as a base to work through his plans for attack.
This is where Abbas Boutrab came to establish his new life. Now using the alias of Joseph Jafari, just as he had done in Holland, he applied to the immigration authorities to stay in the Republic. Amongst Dublin's thriving Muslim community, he blended in easily, finding employment in a bakery.
Ireland is maybe very easy. The atmosphere is better. They are less racist than the rest. You know, all those things are factors that would encourage people like Boutrab to find solace in the country or a home in the country.
Although he was a regular worshipper at this mosque on Dublin's South Circular Road, he appears to have gone largely unnoticed by the Muslim leadership.
I don't know anything about him. I haven't talked to anybody, and nobody has talked to me about him. There seemed to be nothing, you know, about him here in the community. I mean, to be honest, I don't know what he was doing, you know.
If Boutrab wanted a quiet life, it was about to be threatened. In May 2002, the Republic's immigration authorities caught up with him after his application for asylum was rejected and he was ordered to be deported. Boutrab ignored it, but 5 days after his deportation date, he crashed into the back of a car in Carrick-on-Shannon. The woman he drove into says he showed very little emotion.
He was certainly a cool dude. Could you picture if you were in that man's shoes and you found yourself in this semi-rural place in the middle of Ireland, and suddenly, out of the blue, you're surrounded by Gardaí and people taking your particulars and everything, when I presume he wanted to be totally incognito or certainly not the focus of attention. Could you imagine what he must have felt like at that moment? But he didn't display any emotion, none.
Boutrab was arrested by the Gardaí and charged with dangerous driving. Once again, he gave a false name and address. The Gardaí released him on bail, and the Algerian returned to his job in the bakery in Dublin. But his troubles were far from over. 7 weeks later, he and a co-worker got involved in an argument. Boutrab produced a knife and stabbed him, leaving him with serious injuries.
By now, Abbas Boutrab realized that his time in the Republic was coming to an end. He knew the Gardaí would want to speak to him after the stabbing, and he realized the immigration authorities would also want to talk to him. So he decided to flee, and he headed for the safety of Northern Ireland.
It does seem to be an unusual place to go, Northern Ireland. But I'm not hugely surprised because if you're a terrorist suspect looking to bring down an airliner, you would try and look for an out-the-way place to actually start your mission. And Northern Ireland might be a good place to do that.
Abbas Boutrab's behaviour in Belfast followed a tried and tested pattern. Once again he applied for asylum and continued to use false names, removing any traces of his past. He became a familiar sight at the mosque and at the Central Library, but his library visits were far from innocent. Using the internet, he began to look at extremist Islamic websites which promoted suicide bombings. He also gained access to bomb-making guides.
The key document described how to make an explosive device and smuggle it innocuously onto an aircraft, assemble it onto an aircraft and explode it whilst the aircraft was in mid-flight. It made reference to the shoe bomber Richard Reid and how he got caught, and it advised any person who was going to do this how not to get caught.
People are free, certainly, to access these websites. It's not in any way illegal. The difference, of course, with Boutrab is that he went further and he made preparations, which indicated that he was somebody who was preparing for an imminent attack.
Now Boutrab began to gather the component parts for a bomb.
He had a transistor radio that had capacitors missing from it, and that was quite significant in that the device on the aircraft uses capacitors as an initiating device.
But an unexpected call to his North Belfast apartment would see his plan unravel. In April 2003, the police were called out to a domestic dispute at the complex. They encountered Boutrab, and his behaviour immediately aroused their suspicions. Officers left the scene, but soon realised they had to return.
When I went back to base, they had been looking through material that had been sent up to them from Garda Síochána, and they came across a wanted poster, and a bit of good police work identified that the person who was on the wanted poster, who was wanted for an assault in Dublin, was indeed the man who claimed to be Abbas Boutrab.
As an illegal immigrant, Boutrab was taken to Maghaberry prison. Later, police searched his flat, where they discovered tools and bomb-making instructions on computer disks, which were sent to MI5.
We were quite surprised, obviously, when someone you're quite shocked. We didn't believe there was anything behind it, that there was any truth to it.
As investigations continued, Boutrab waited for a trial date. He clearly saw his incarceration as political. To one well-wisher he wrote, "I was really pleased and happy when people like you knows what's going on in their concentration camps. I am one of the Muslims who are tortured mentally. Anyway, I don't give up. No surrender to the Muppet and their masters."
He didn't appear as a very militant man. He didn't express any hatred for the Western world, and he didn't come up with a very sophisticated speech to explain. He didn't establish any political goals, or he felt more like a confused, a bit paranoid man, more than a well-established, organized, thinking, cold terrorist.
Boutrab eventually stood trial last November at Belfast Crown Court. The case made legal history. It was the first time an Al-Qaeda suspect was tried in the United Kingdom without a jury. In a deadlocked court under the eye of a single judge, the prosecution alleged that Boutrab was part of a network of extremists. Boutrab had visited Finsbury Park Mosque in London, home of the radical cleric Abu Hamza, now in jail for soliciting murder. It's a place familiar to Reda Hussein, an Algerian who fled his homeland. He was recruited by British intelligence when he came to London. He posed as an Islamic militant and went undercover at Finsbury Park Mosque.
It was a frightening place, very frightening place.
Why?
Because you really hear only about death and killing. You have to die, you have to kill. There's nothing else in this world. So you see some people being recruited, slowly, as young as 10 years old people. Started to being
Who were they being recruited for?
For the next generation of the fighters who have to fight the Western world.
The court heard that Boutrab was also in phone contact with one of Abu Hamza's advisors, but the prosecution failed to convince the judge that his connection with Finsbury Park Mosque was sinister.
I've spoken to several people in the Metropolitan Police who really sort of just shake their heads in disbelief at the fuss that's made about Finsbury Park. You have one or two loudmouths who go somewhere and suddenly everybody who's associated with them gets tarred with the same brush and is seen as a potential threat.
James Dingley has studied the Boutrab case. He was asked by the defence team to consider if the Algerian fitted the normal profile of a terrorist.
This was not somebody who was performing according to normal terrorist profiles. His peripatetic lifestyle, the fact that he was constantly on the move, the fact that he was part of no fixed community, he had no permanent abode, he seemed to have no close friends. Again, this is the total opposite of what you'd expect from somebody who was involved with terrorism.
And there was one key question the police were unable to answer. Although they claimed Boutrab was building a bomb to blow up an airliner, no details were ever revealed about his target.
One of the things he said is, look, I had no explosives. You know, there was no proof basically of more than the intent. And that was his line of defense. It's very difficult to know. I think he was more of a wannabe jihadist than a connected, you know, Islamic fundamentalist or terrorist. But it's very difficult to ascertain.
So how seriously should the police have taken the threat posed by Abbas Boutrab? Was he really planning an attack, or was he simply a fantasist obsessed with violent websites?
There's always the possibility that he's some kind of Walter Mitty character and maybe some kind of Unabomber type figure. But it seems unlikely in this case. There's one particular document you had to know the password to get into the file. So somebody has given him the password, which suggests that he wasn't working alone.
One of the password-protected documents was a guide in the manufacture of explosives. It was written in Arabic, translated into English. The cover note read, "May blessing and peace be upon the leader of the Mujahideen. The Islamic Information Center presents equipment for those longing for the Lord of the Worlds."
There are indications in that document that carries an email address, for example, which has been used in the past to distribute bomb-making guides and manuals. I mean, he was obviously working on the next version of the shoe bomb, if you like.
But Boutrab wasn't just using the internet for information. The court was told the police had discovered a text message he had sent to one of Holland's leading Al-Qaeda suspects, who was later jailed for terrorism offences. And the prosecution had another trump card: the equipment that had been discovered at Boutrab's flat.
There were a number of specialist tools, highly sophisticated stethoscope that would be used in the motoring trade, a number of sophisticated files, drills, and other tools that you wouldn't normally have, and we think they were there for a sinister purpose.
But would Boutrab's bomb actually work? The PSNI decided to bring in the FBI. Donald Sockleben is the agent who captured the Unabomber after the FBI's most expensive manhunt in history. He also investigated the Oklahoma bombing and the September the 11th attacks. Sockleben was assigned to the Boutrab case.
Well, when I first looked at the documents, I was a little skeptical because in the unit I work in, almost every day we get in some kind of a report that someone is buying something or doing something, and a lot of times it's just innocent activity. But as soon as I had a chance to read these documents, it was clear that they were very specific about what was to be done. So I started to just follow the instructions. I went shopping. I went out to some local stores and bought the items that were listed in the documents. And they were all very easy to obtain and very inexpensive. I brought those things back here to the laboratory and started putting them together, at least following the instructions. There's some recipes in there for bomb making. But more importantly, there was a number of instructions, very detailed instructions, on then how to smuggle it on board a commercial aircraft. And then it became a question of, would it really work? We built one of the devices and put it on a mock-up of an aircraft and placed the device between the seats and the skin of the aircraft and detonated it. And the results were quite devastating. potentially this bomb could have devastated an airplane, could have killed many people.
The FBI's results sealed Boutrab's fate.
At the end of the 6-week trial, Mr. Justice Weatherup found Abbas Boutrab guilty of possessing articles connected to terrorism and having information of use to terrorists. He said Abbas Boutrab had lied, and his storage of capacitors, computer disks and tools was supportive of guilt. He then sent Abbas Boutrab to prison for 6 years.
Although Abbas Boutrab was Ireland's first Al-Qaeda suspect, his case has generated little debate amongst Muslims in Belfast and Dublin, where Boutrab spent time. At Clonskeagh Mosque in Dublin, the most important centre for Islam in Ireland, leaders have little to say about the affair.
I never heard a lot about it, apart of just reading here and there. So it's not an issue. We consider this is not an issue here in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. So I cannot condemn something that I don't know the details.
In the Muslim community, there have been quiet whispers about Boutrab.
For some Muslims, like Sheikh Shahid Satardian, the leadership's response to the Boutrab affair has been far from adequate.
We do realize that Boutrab is both looked upon as a criminal and at the same time is looked upon as some type of hero. You see, people like Boutrab and his activities and his ideology or his ideas have to be condemned more viciously, and it has to be pointed out very clearly that this is not what is required of Muslims, and Muslims do not behave in this manner.
Critics argue that this ambivalence among Muslim leaders is not confined to the Boutrab affair. Clonskeagh Mosque is also the base for the European Council for Fatwa and Research, headed by the leading Islamic scholar Dr. Joseph Al-Qaradawi, who's banned from entering the US. Although he has no links to Boutrab or Al-Qaeda, he does have controversial views on suicide bombings in Israel.
Secondly, I consider this type of martyrdom operation as an indication of justice of Allah Almighty. Allah is just. Through His infinite wisdom, He has given the weak what the strong do not possess, and that is the ability to turn their bodies into bombs. Like the
Qaradawi is known throughout the world and indeed in documents in the UN as the Sheikh of Death. This man has authorized through his fatwa suicide bombings in Israel, suicide bombings in Iraq.
Some people would be concerned because there is this individual called Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, who I understand has links here. He has an interesting view on suicide bombs, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, he got his opinion on this issue, but not necessarily everybody is agreeing with his opinion, but he has his opinion. You can ask him personally, on his opinion, of course.
But
because he put the conditions for the opinion. Unfortunately, his opinion been used widely in a very wrong way. But anyway, that's the best thing is to ask him, not to ask me about it.
But he's linked here to the centre.
He is not linked in a sense, and he is linked. I mean, what I mean that the European Council for Fatwa and Research, the General Secretariat of the European Council for Fatwa and Research is here in the center, and he's the chairman of that council. But as a center, we have nothing to do with the council itself.
The leaders of Clonskeagh Mosque are clear. Qaradawi's message is not their own. But critics argue that their very association with the European Council for Fatwa and Research sends a confusing message out to young Muslims.
The large majority of moderate Muslims want their mosques rescued from this type of fundamentalism, because the longer these institutions remain rooted in Dublin City, the more probable it is that young immigrants will be radicalized.
We were the first who condemned what happened in the 11th September. And that is witnessed even by everybody, that we were the first people who condemned what happened, and of course in Madrid, and of course in the 77th, in the London. That is not acceptable by any Islamic value, in our opinion.
Within Northern Ireland's Muslim community, a veil of secrecy surrounds the Boutrab affair. He worshipped here at the Belfast Mosque, where Jamal Al-Qaeda is a leading figure. He knew Abbas Boutrab, working as an interpreter for him and attending his court hearings, but he declined to take part in this program.
My message to Jamal Al-Qaeda would be, if you are the director of the Islamic Center, and I would say that you call your community together and your congregation and make a very strong statement in condemning the activities of Abbas Boutrab.
But Jamal Al-Qaeda told Spotlight that he has always condemned terrorism. Such acts, he said, were against Islam.
I wouldn't want to spread the fear of terrorism. The fact is that these people are a very small minority. The vast majority of the Muslim community are law-abiding, decent, honest people and deserve to be here. We just have to be vigilant for the one or two that do not deserve to be here.
Attacks in Madrid and London show that young Muslims are being radicalized across Europe and continue to be drawn into a holy war. How to fight this threat continues to pose the biggest challenge to Western governments. Al-Qaeda's battlefield now stretches across the globe. Although Abbas Boutrab's base was in Belfast, his target could have been anywhere.
Northern Ireland has now featured very prominently on the map of international terrorism. 52 people were murdered here in London last year, and we have to say that there's nothing to suggest that that won't happen again. Obviously we're doing everything within our power to prevent it, but the reality is that there is a continuing and real terrorist threat to the people of the United Kingdom.
Everyone in the free world should feel threatened about this case. It's not just the people of Northern Ireland, it's not just the people of New York, it's not just the people in that little town in Pennsylvania where Flight 93 came down. We're all in this together. It's out there, they're looking for weak spots, they're looking for places that they think we're not as aware of, and so we all have to be vigilant.
Abbas Boutrab is hoping for another day in court. His legal team has launched an appeal against his conviction, but it may never be heard. His long period of detention while awaiting trial means he will be released from prison in around 6 months' time. It's likely that he'll then be sent back to Algeria.
My view is that certainly he should be deported. He should not be allowed to remain in this country. He is now convicted of terrorist offences. He is very clearly a dangerous terrorist and a danger to our society.
In the eyes of the law, Abbas Boutrab will leave Northern Ireland as an international terrorist who brought his holy war to Belfast. In many ways, he will depart just as he arrived, as a mystery man whose real identity only he truly knows.